Hey guys, hope all is well. Glad to be with you guys. It's been quite a while. I've really been busy at work lately, and it's been a bit harder to make these videos every day. Um, in this video, I'm going to continue the series I started a little while back called Chess Secrets You Wish You Knew. In the previous videos, we talked about different ideas like weak squares uh, and trading minor pieces when you lack space. Um, and in this video, I'm going to discuss positive and negative pawn tension. I think understanding pawn tension is one of the most critical things you can understand in chess because it helps dictate the flow of your pieces. Um, and that's just a little bit of a snippet into that, but I think it's just a really, really important topic that's worth exploring. When do you relieve the tension? When do you keep it there? I think part of that is identifying who's it in favor of. And so we're going to look at a few examples and sort of get a sense of who the pawn who the pawn tension is in favor of by looking at some top level games. So the first example is actually from a Magnus Carlsen game against David Barmitza in the Grenke Chess Classic. But the tournament, even the players, doesn't matter. It's really a question of the actual moves. So let me get to that game and yes. Okay, so e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e5, a6, bishop a4. And this is all Ruy Lopez stuff, but this is not the point of the exercise. And I just want to get very quickly to the example, because that's where we need to stop and think. So, okay, so actually, here's actually the first interesting point in the Ruy Lopez. When white plays d4, and then black plays knight b d7, there's a pawn tension here, right? The d pawn is and the e pawn are in tension, and it's sort of tricky to sort of figure out who's in favor of. Here, I would say the pawn tension is in favor of white because if black releases the tension, then white has more central control, and so you can identify that as being a pawn tension that's sort of positive for white and presently probably negative for black. Now, the situation can change very quickly. So after knight b2, bishop b7, bishop c2, rook e8, knight f1, and bishop f8, now the pawn tension is sort of neutral because now black is actually threatening to take on e4 and actually win a pawn. So black has to play white has to play knight g3, and in this position, there's the pawn. Both sides sort of wouldn't mind keeping the pawn tension and sort of wait for an appropriate moment to sort of capitalize on it, and that really sort of marks the contours of the game. But that's actually not the pawn tension I wanted to focus on in this setup. The one I really want to focus on in this setup comes after black's move g6. It comes right here when white plays a4. This move is so thematic in the Ruy Lopez, and it's really important to understand this pawn tension because I think it really can help guide your decision making and your evaluation of how this works. Now, in this position, a4 is such a strong move because at any given moment, white can try to open up the file with a takes b5 and then get the rook on a1 in the game. But more importantly, it's a pawn tension that's very annoying for black because if black plays a move like b takes a4, all of a sudden, after a move like rook takes a4, the a pawn is isolated and weak on the a file, and white has a semi-open a file for the rook, and black has created an additional pawn island. So now the pawn structure is sort of shattered, and the structure just favors white. So one of the reasons that a4 is such a strong move is because this is now positive pawn tension for white. And so black doesn't really want to take. So black just played bishop g7, ignoring it. But again, white just has the luxury here and is sort of spoiled for choice. White can keep this tension as long as he wishes and then open it up at an opportune moment. And it's instructive in seeing just how Carlsen does that. First, Carlsen plays bishop d3 to put immediate pressure on the b5 pawn and sort of forcing black's hand a little bit, saying, what are you going to do about the b pawn? And that's why black plays c6. But here you can see that now the bishop on b7 is locked in by its own pawn on c6, and this is not necessarily the intention of playing the bishop to b7 and having that long diagonal. So white sort of achieved what he set out to do by playing a4 and bishop d3, because now there's less pressure on his e4 pawn by the bishop on b7. So now development ensues, and they play around this pawn tension, and then again bishop c2. Protect here, it's a very important move because it protects the d4 pawn, so it did its job attacking the b5 pawn. Now it has to go back to c2, so the queen on d2 defends that d4 pawn in another way, because black had 3 attackers on that d4 pawn, so there needed to be 3 defenders. And so this pawn tension in the middle is sort of approximately equal. Both sides don't necessarily mind that, but the real problem is this pawn tension on the a file. And so you can see this manifests after queen takes, queen f6, and all these moves. This pawn tension on the a file is really the big problem. And then here's the critical break. I actually played it a second too fast, but after rook a, d8, d5. And this is the critical break that really changes the contours of the position, because you can see that white is deciding to go forward in the center based on that tension, and black has to deal with it. And what happens here is very instructive, because black is not super worse here, but it's just easier to play white, and it really is amazing what happens in the next few moves. After d5, c takes, e takes, the queen sort of has to move, because if the knight moves somewhere, then from e6 white gets a knight e4. So black threw in this move queen f4, trying to trade queens. But the problem is after queen takes f4, knight takes f4, and knight e4, not only is white hitting the d6 pawn, but there's also still this pawn tension on b5. And even here you might say, oh, it's not a big deal, like black could just deal with this in a reasonable way. There isn't really an easy way to deal with this, because if black plays knight b6, knight f6 is a fork, so that's sort of out of the question. So black had to go for bishop takes d5. But after a takes b5, now white's finally capitalizing on that pawn tension. A takes b5, knight takes d6, attacking the rook, rook e6, knight e4 back, f5, knight fg5, rook e7. And again, I'm playing these moves quickly because they're not really the purpose why when I get to this position. But g3, bishop takes, f takes, g takes, rook f8, knight takes, rook takes. It's this position where the dust is settled and the material is still equal, but Carlsen plays a move here so strong, and really it becomes sort of the beginning of the end of this position, and it's this move b4. And this move essentially is all connected to that pawn tension 20 moves ago, nearly 20 moves ago, that was made with e4. I mean with a4. It was 15 moves ago exactly, or 20 moves ago exactly, because a4 was played on move 15. 20 moves ago, this move a4 put pressure on the b5 pawn, and as a consequence of that d5 break earlier in the game, about 10 moves ago, black had to play c takes d5, and what you have now is a b5 pawn that is isolated and weak on the b file, and it makes it a much easier target to corral. And so even though white also has an isolated pawn on h3, it's much easier to defend as less of a target than the one on b5, and Carlsen went on to win this game very smoothly with a very nice conversion connected to this weakness of the b5 pawn. Now, you can look at the rest of this game to see how it actually panned out, but it panned out just like I did, and I'll just show you the next few moves just to give you a sense of it. Knight f6, knight d6, no way to save that pawn, rook f3, rook takes b5, and this was pretty much the game, because even though black gets to play rook takes h3 and the material is equal, white has 2 connected, unchallenged passed pawns, and the queenside pawns here are a little bit more valuable than black's kingside pawns. So again, all of this sort of happened because of that positive pawn tension that white has with a4, with the move a4 against black's b5 pawn. And it happens actually in many, many different Ruy Lopez's. So now I'm going to show you another example of how that happens in another Ruy Lopez game with a very, very similar example where Victor Boligan was playing. So let me switch over to that. Perfect. Okay. And so in this game, we have another Ruy Lopez, so I'm just going to zip through and show you exactly where a4 comes in, because that's really the thematic pawn tension that happens in the Ruy Lopez on that all-time a4. So here, again, a4 challenges the b5 pawn, but also just makes it... It's not that white's going to take right away, but it's always something that black has to think about, and there's no easy way to release the pawn tension. I didn't mention this in the previous game, but note that b4 here, which you might say, isn't that a desirable move here? The knight's on c6 and actually protects the pawn. Doesn't it release the tension? It's actually a mistake because of the move a5. And after a5, the a6 pawn is fixed here, and it's a little bit isolated and weak compared to white's a5 move, because it just takes a little bit more space here. And then again, this a6 pawn is pretty weak. Not to mention the fact after b4, after b4, there is the white does have the option of just playing d5, I believe. Although maybe black has something to say about that with d takes c3 and then hitting d2. But basically, it's really, b4 is just sort of out of the question because of this a5 move. And again, it's just not what you want to be doing. So we see this a4 move again, really being a nagging sense of a nagging resource for white, and it creates positive pawn tension for white and negative pawn tension for black because black doesn't have an easy way to release it. So let's just see the next few moves and see how this goes. So black releases the pawn tension in the middle. Very double-edged decision, by the way. We were talking about releasing in the middle is sometimes a risky thing to do. But black had this idea of breaking, and so d5 was played. And here's really the critical moment, because after knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, e5, knight e4, and knight b3, white tries to keep the knights on the board to harass the light-squared bishop, but additionally still has this nagging pawn tension at the a and b pawn. And you might say two things. One, why isn't rook takes e5 played? Isn't that just a free pawn? Well, it isn't, because f3 wins a piece on the spot. Note that the rook on e5 is unprotected, and the knight it wouldn't be able to move without losing material. The second question is, and probably the more difficult question to ask, is why not b takes a4? Isn't it just a free pawn? Okay, I ruined my pawn structure, but a pawn is a pawn. And the answer is it isn't a free pawn, because after this move, knight d4, which hits the bishop on c6 with tempo, after bishop d7, white just recaptures the pawn when bishop takes a4. And after bishop takes, rook takes, we see a similar scenario to what I was trying to illustrate in the first game, where black released the pawn tension a little bit too early, and now this a pawn is isolated and weak. Not to mention the fact that now you've given this rook the half-open a file. And as it turned out, that really was a recipe for disaster, because in a few moves, white went on to just get a winning position playing with a rook along the fourth rank as well. Black played queen h4, bishop e3, knight c5, rook a5, queen e4, and bishop takes h6. And I'm not going to go over the rest of the tactics here, but suffice to say, it was enough to win the game. So again, we see this tension, the a4, b5 pawn tension here, is really turning out to be a real asset for white in these Ruy Lopez positions. And understanding how this pawn tension works and is really important understanding the game of chess generally. Let me switch to yet another example. We looked at two Ruy Lopez games, so I think it's more appropriate to switch now to Sicilian. Everyone loves the Sicilian, right? Well, not me, but most people do. And yeah, this is a Sicilian. It's a blitz game between two strong grandmasters, or at least Carlsen is a strong grandmaster, 2700 plus. And it's the closed Sicilian. If you've watched any of my videos, you know that I have a strong disdain for the closed Sicilian. I just don't respect it. I don't think you ought to be giving up the d4 essential square with white the way that you do here, giving up the d4 square. And anyways, let's zip through. Again, white gives up the d4 square. I'm not a fan of that. And black decides to take it over. And there's a critical position coming up, b5, with b5, g4. White normally tries to expand on the king side, and black plays b4. Then knight d1, a5. And what happens here a lot of times is white doesn't want to take the d4 knight with a minor piece, because black will play c takes d4 and have the c file to get counterplay on. So just to illustrate that, like if knight takes d4, c takes d4, there's usually a really good counterplay on the c pawn after like bishop a6 and rook c8 or something. So that doesn't happen. And after knight g3 is played, normally white tries to attack the knight by playing c3. But here's the problem. Black's expanding very quickly and plays a4. And after c3, the knight goes back to c6. And you have a situation where this c3 pawn is now going to be a constant source of harassment for black's pawns. And additionally, it sort of facilitates the play of the fianchettoed bishop for black on the long diagonal, and the rook on b8 on the nearly open b file. And so, as a consequence, this is actually positive pawn tension for black. And it happens all the time in closed Sicilians. I see this where black gets this really quick pawn storm and gets this really annoying pawn tension. And the problem is it's tough to release, because if you play a move like c4, you're surrendering all these dark squares forever. And tactically, it doesn't work as well after a move like a3, which really opens up this whole diagonal. And look at what happened. White played f5, trying to play f6 and sort of maybe force a concession, force black to take on f5, or do something like that. And this is actually, I would say, positive pawn tension for white, because black doesn't really want to take with either pawn. It's just not very helpful, because white would just take back and still have the threat of f6. And so black leaves the pawn tension there and plays bishop e5, a brilliant move, really, getting the bishop outside of the chain, attacking, outside of the potential f6 move, attacking the knight on g3, and still entertaining pressure on the diagonal. And after bishop f4 is played, black played a really star quality move, a3, which completely undermines the pawn chain on the diagonal, because either way that white tries to take and release the tension really doesn't solve the problems. If you play c takes b4, black would throw in a takes b2, and that would be awful for white to deal with. And if black played b takes a3, I think black would probably play b takes c3. And again, now these double a pawns are just really weak on that file, and black's coming in somehow with this counterplay with the rook on b8, maybe the queen coming to a5. So it's really, again, here, after a3, positive pawn tension for black connected to this pawn storm. And it's not pleasant. I mean, after bishop takes e5, knight takes e5, f6, king h8 was played because of this mate threat, so black did actually blunder a piece here. But it's really not the game that I'm concerned about. It's the pawn tension, and amazingly connected on that pawn tension, black went on to win the game, but that's not because of it was a high-quality game. Again, it was blitz. I just want to illustrate this pawn tension on the queen side right here, after b4. This is really positive pawn tension for black on the queen side. And on the same token, the pawn tension on the king side is very good for white. So looking at that pawn tension is key. Another example, because I'm just going to give you a ton of examples, is a game where between two of the giants in chess, Kasparov and Ivanchuk. Let me switch over to that game. So this game is actually a really famous game, a really well-known time that Ivanchuk used this line of the French winnower, this really weird line where after e5, you don't play c5, which is the main move here, but you go b6. And the point is that you want to go c5, but you want to support it with the pawn b6. And after a3, instead of taking on c3, going back with bishop f8. And this really confounded Kasparov, because in these next few moves, he really played a little bit too aggressively and didn't really get anything. Ivanchuk just developed his pieces. And again, c5, this was the key break. And it's really connected to this notion of really positive pawn tension. Here, it's positive pawn tension for black. Because if white plays d takes c5, that's sort of undesirable because of this move knight c6, which attacks both the e5 pawn and the c5 pawn. So black will recover something, and additionally, white has spoiled his pawn structure. So after c3, white tried to keep the pawn chain intact, but black continued to develop and was able to get really positive pawn tension. And then here was a really brilliant move because Ivanchuk did play c4, and recognizing when you should sort of adjust the pawn tension is also a difficult thing to do. Here he decides c4 is worth playing because he wanted to entertain putting more tension on on white's queenside pawns by playing b4, and he couldn't do that by keeping the pawn on c5, because if he did, then white could eventually play d takes c5 and knight d4 and actually get an outpost in the center for his knights. So after c4, bishop c2, and knight b6, this is one of those famous games where none of the pieces are exchanged for quite some time, but black just gets this immense buildup of pressure on the queen side. You can see rook b8, queen d8, knight g4, and then finally b4. And already black is doing pretty well here. And after a takes, c takes, that was the first sign that something had gone wrong, because white is spoiling his pawn chain. Right, white had one really decent pawn chain. Now c takes b4 ruins that, because now the b pawn is isolated, and Kasparov just couldn't stand up to that pawn pressure. And after knight takes, black is threatening to get the bishop on c2, forces bishop b1, and then bishop d7. And again, it's very important that black isn't castled, because there's no real attack on his king in the middle. And after b3, rook e8, rook takes, queen takes, b takes e4, knight takes e4. White has actually exchanged his weak b pawn, but look at the outposts of these black knights on c4 and b4. They're dominant, and Kasparov went on to lose the game in just 5 moves. Again, pawn tension is the name of the game here, and identifying when it's positive in your favor or negative in your favor really dictates the way you should react. And yeah, here Kasparov just didn't react well. The last example I'm going to show, before I sound like a broken record with all these examples, is a game that was actually played between Magnus Carlsen and Nakamura. Again, I'm showing another Magnus Carlsen game because he's just really good at this. He's really good at identifying these tensions and these small nuances. It's part of what makes him a really, really talented chess player. Is this game he played against Nakamura at the Gashimov Memorial in 2014. And I really liked the way he handled this, because it was a slow Slav, which is probably one of my favorite openings in chess to play. And here, after bishop e2, I remember when this was the fashion, bishop e2. The point is that it still is fashion. The point is against the a6 Slav. If they bring the bishop out on f5, white's actually threatening knight h4 here. So like let's say black plays knight e6, and then knight h4 will be the move, and white will get the 2 bishops. And so black would play h6 here. And the idea here after bishop e2 is a beautifully subtle move to play bishop d3, now forcing the trade of these light squared bishops, because black can't retreat to g6 like he normally does because the h pawn is moved and he can't take with the h pawn. So notice the difference of e6 here, and then bishop d3, black could just play bishop g6. But now with knight h4, after h6, after h6, bishop d3, bishop d3, black can't play to g6 because of this capture. Really, really cool finesse. So after bishop d3, black took on d3, and we have some exchanges. And the whole crux of this position comes down to the pawn tension of the c4 and d5 pawns. The reason this is a positive pawn tension for white is because if black releases that tension, I repeat, if black releases that pawn tension, then white has a central pawn majority. So if black plays d takes c4, queen takes c4, black has 5 versus 4 in the middle. And the c pawn is, it's sort of in the middle, but not really. Now, so white can sort of keep the pressure, keep making moves, and black always has to think about trying to get some counterplay because all the counterplay is connected with d takes c4. So just to illustrate that a little bit, white just tries to hold put. And the other problem is that black really wants to play e5 or sometimes c5, but in these structures you can't really do that if there's a pawn tension against your d5 pawn. So you have to release that tension first before you get in any meaningful break. And so it's just a small nagging pressure, and Carlsen is so good at this. And so there's a small build-up. Of course, Carlsen keeps his bishop. Small build-up, small build-up. Again, Nakamura is trying to play, but it's making a few weaknesses. f5 weakens the e5 square a little bit more. Carlsen's targeting those squares, needling a little bit. And then, boom, we have d takes c4. And this is sort of the finale or the build-up of tension that Nakamura eventually is like, you know what, I just want to do something, I want to open it up, I want to get something going. And it really proves to be disastrous. Because after d takes c4, b takes c4, white clearly has the superior pawn chain, and there's still these weaknesses on the fifth rank, c5 and e5 and the like. And so Magnus goes on to have a very easy game, and after knight f7, he just continues to squeeze, playing a4, a5, bishop e1, and again there's these targets on the fifth rank, a5, c5, e5, and after b6, Carlsen's like, oh, I'm just going to trade queens. And after this trade, the tension or the weaknesses in the pawn tension here still doesn't go away, because after rook a8, f3, rook b8, rook c2, he's egging Nakamura into playing b5, and he does it. And the beautiful thing about b5 is I think Nakamura is trying to secure the d5 square for his knight, and thinking that maybe Carlsen will go c takes b5 or something like that. But here, Carlsen just plops the knight on c5 and says, this pawn tension on b5 is still positive tension for me, because if you play b4, then I can just play knight b3 and blockade this pawn and have permanent pressure on the a5 pawn as well. And if you take on c4, which is what Nakamura did after rook takes c4, there are two isolated pawns, the c6 pawn and the a5 pawn, which proves to really be very ugly in the proceedings that follow. And so after knight d7, bishop d2, e5, e4, takes. Again, look at the difference in pawn structure now is quite profound. And okay, after rook takes e6, Carlsen's actually just won a pawn. And after rook g6 and knight c4 and d takes at e5, again, white's just up a pawn and just has really good pressure. And eventually, he went on to win this game. So, what can I say? I think I've shown a lot of games. I've spoke relatively quickly, but the gist of this video is just to emphasize and identify when pawn tension is good for you, when it's positive, and when it's negative. And in all these examples, I pretty much looked at tensions where it was mainly positive and what to do when it's positive. Well, the question is, what do you do when you have negative pawn tension? I would say you should try and bring pieces around that tension, or at least try to create some activity elsewhere to mitigate against that tension. Because the problem is the longer that game goes, if that pawn tension still remains negative, you're going to be in deep trouble, because white will try, or the white or black, if they're the side that has the positive pawn tension, will try to exploit it and subsequently open up the position to flood their pieces. So just like in one of the previous examples where there was a Ruy Lopez position, and I was talking about the d4 pawn tension against e5, and it was white had the pawn tension, had the positive pawn tension at the beginning. In fact, I'll go back. Let me go back to that point. Give me one moment. Yes, I believe this is what I wanted. Let's say we go back here to this game. In this example in the Ruy Lopez of the d4, we're mainly talking about the a4, b5 pawn tension. But in this particular example, white is the one that has positive pawn tension on the e5 square, because after knight bd7, again, white still is the one that's putting pressure there, and black doesn't really want to take on d4 and forfeit the whole center. But that tension is neutralized in a few moves after bishop b, knight db2, bishop b7, bishop c2, rook e8, knight f1, and bishop f8, because black gets enough pieces around that pawn tension where he can actually entertain some threats as well. So the basic gist of it is that if you do have a negative pawn tension, sometimes you won't be able to deal with it. But sometimes what you can do is bring pieces around that tension to sort of mitigate against the possibility of something opening up. Because that's what happens. Pieces get into play and things start to happen because of pawn exchanges or because of pawn openings. So just keeping that in mind when you're playing is critical. So anyways, I hope this was somewhat informative, somewhat helpful, and thanks for watching. And please do share if you think I'm doing a good job, or if you think there might be other chess people that are interested. Don't hesitate to give a shout. All right, peace. Have a good Tuesday.